Hello, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue our in-depth study of Acts. Today, we take up Stephen's defense before the full Sanhedrin court. Recall from our last lesson that Stephen had been arrested for, in part, continuing to teach the Gospels, despite the fact that the church had been warned not to teach it anymore. But the heavier charge against him is blasphemy against Moses, against God, and against temple religion / holy things. Stephen gives a long speech here, which many scholars conclude is the most important speech in Acts. And Acts is known for a few long speeches. It's known for its speeches, for one thing. It is a long reading, so we'll devote most of our time today to reading that, which is chapter 7, the first 53 verses. We'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Then the high priest asked him, "Are these things so?" And Stephen replied, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our ancestor Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Leave your country and your relatives and go to the land that I will show you.' Then he left the country of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After his father died, God had him move from there to this country in which you are now living. He did not give him any of it as heritage, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as his possession and to his descendants after him, even though he had no child. And God spoke in these terms, that his descendants would be resident aliens in a country belonging to others, who would enslave them and mistreat them during their 400 years. But I will judge the nation that they serve, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. The patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt, but God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions, and enabled him to win favor and to show wisdom when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and appointed him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now there came a famine throughout Egypt and Canaan, and great suffering, and our ancestors could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our ancestors there on their first visit. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and invited his father Jacob and all his relatives to come to him, 75 in all. So Jacob went down to Egypt. He himself died there, as well as our ancestors, and their bodies were brought back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the son of Hamor in Shechem. But as the time drew near for the fulfillment of the promise that God had made to Abraham, our people in Egypt increased and multiplied until another king who had not known Joseph ruled over Egypt. He dealt craftily with our race and forced our ancestors to abandon their infants so that they would die. At this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful before God. For 3 months he was brought up in his father's house. And when he was abandoned, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. So Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of Egyptians and was powerful in his words and deeds. When he was 40 years old, it came to his heart to visit his relatives, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his kinfolks would understand that God through him was rescuing them, but they did not understand. The next day he came to some of them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other? But the man who was wronging the neighbor pushed Moses aside, saying, Who made you ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When he heard this, Moses fled and became the resident alien in the land of Midian. There he became the father of 2 sons. Now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight, and as he approached, he looked. There came the voice of the Lord, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses began to tremble and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have surely seen the mistreatment of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their groaning, and I have come down to rescue them. Come now, I will send you to Egypt. It was this Moses whom they rejected when they said, Who made you a ruler and a judge? And who God now sent as both ruler and liberator through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out, having performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up a prophet for you from your own people, as he raised me up. He is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living oracles to give to us. Our ancestors were unwilling to obey him. Instead, they pushed him aside, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, Make gods for us, who will lead the way for us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. At that time they made a calf offering, a sacrifice to the idols, and reveled in the works of their hands. But God turned away from them and handed them over to worship, and the worship to host of heavens, as it is written in the book of the prophets. Did you offer to me slain victims and sacrifices? 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel. Do you look alone in the tent of Moloch and the stars of your god Rephan, the image that you made to worship? So I will remove you beyond Babylon. Our ancestors had the tent of testimony in the wilderness, as God directed when he spoke to Moses, ordering him to make it according to the pattern he had seen. Our ancestors in turn brought it with Joshua when they deposed the nation that God drove them before our ancestors. And it was there until the time of David, who found favor with God and asked that he might find a dwelling place for the house of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands, as the prophet says, Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all of these things? You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ear, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it. So that's Stephen's famous speech in his defense before the Sanhedrin. Dr. Luke Timothy Johnson of Emory University, which I think he's emeritus now from there, teaches that this speech is designed by Luke to provide the reader with the keys to understanding everything that had happened in Acts written by Luke up to this point. In other words, these first 7 chapters, concerning the Acts of the Apostles, why the Apostles were doing what they were doing, and so forth. Some others would say it is the most difficult speech in Acts to analyze and interpret. But Dr. William H. Wellman, who's of the Methodist faith, I believe, but he was a professor at the time he wrote this at Duke University, argues that the interpretation is very straightforward. He says, we could paraphrase it by saying Stephen's speech here says, in so many words, you all have your nerve to charge that I have violated Moses and his law. Look at yourselves before you cast stones. Some scholars suggest Stephen here uses this condensed version of the Israelite history in rebuttal of these charges, rather than a point-by-point defense that would normally have been used in that day and time. It is centered on God's actions and clearly seems designed to ensure he is not blaspheming against Moses, against God in this particular thing, or against the law. His point is that my actions and the Christian movement's actions up to this point, if we can place that term in there, which he doesn't use, have been with God. It's now you stiff-necked Israelites that have failed. You have failed to see the paradigm shifts that have occurred right in front of you. Dr. Carl Holliday of Emory, also emeritus now, teaches that in his storyline, Luke has Stephen devote a disproportionate amount of this to Moses. Why? Because that is the charge, in some ways, the most specific charge that he has against him. He says, notice how he barely mentions Moses receiving the law. So he doesn't mention the law here much. He really doesn't quite come out and say he's receiving the law. He just says some oracles, okay? But that's what he's referring to, scholars say. And no point here does Stephen reflect any disagreement or criticism with the law in specific, that is, the law of Moses. Likewise, his speech is heavily, some scholars say, pro-Moses. This makes Moses look pretty good. Thus, Stephen here, for his own part, has refuted the charges against him for blasphemy against Moses, the law, and God. Some scholars suggest this, although sometimes when we look at this, one of the first things people reckon, well, that's not the story of the Old Testament that I remember. So some people really jump on that point, and scholars take that up and say, yes, this is a variation of the storyline based on our Protestant Bibles, based on the Old Testament version that's in our Bibles. But this is not in disagreement with the Bible that the diaspora Jews used, which was the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. It's pretty well in agreement with that. There's a few points it's a little different, but it's much more in agreement with that than it would be, let's say, with the Hebrew version of the Bible. Dr. Eugene Boring and Fred Craddock in their New Testament commentary make this appointment that here from this defense we also see a connection between the Christian church's early movements and diaspora Judaism. Stephen is quoting from the Septuagint, and so therefore, and the story version that he tells is from more in line with the Septuagint, and consequently, they make this point that shows us pretty strong tie between the early Christian movement and the diaspora Jews, Greek background Jews, if you will, rather than the Palestinian Jews. The Palestinian Jews are basically the ones at odds with Jesus and his teachings, with these apostles here and so forth, but recognize those people were under the rule of the Sadducees, a sect of Judaism that did not believe in the resurrection and controlled the temple. Diaspora Jews used the Septuagint text, while the Palestinian/temple Jews used the Hebrew text. Most, but not all, the variation that's found here in this storyline that he's given relative to the Old Testament is consistent, however, with the Septuagint version. Several scholars suggest these variations are likely still familiar, though, with the Sanhedrin, who also had some people on the Sanhedrin who were of diaspora Jewish background, and they would also have known it well. Most of them probably also spoke Greek and read Greek, and would have had a hard time arguing with any of the points that Stephen has brought up here. Stephen focused on the Israelites' rejection of Moses' leadership, and their turning to idolatry is clearly cited by a number of Old Testament prophets. And we need to recognize that for that component of the Sanhedrin that is Sadducees, okay, rather than Pharisees, and the majority of it was believed to have been, at that day and time, Sadducees. This would have may have in itself been a problem, because after all, the Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's the rest of the Bible, the writings, the Psalms, Hebrews, the Proverbs. Those things are not in their testament, the Sadducees' testament. So therefore, they don't like this being brought up to them. Some scholars point this out, that clearly this was him using that example also as somewhat a slap in the face to the Sadducees. Dr. Holliday notes that Luke has constructed a speech explicitly aligned in Stephen with Old Testament tradition of the sharply worded prophets, and for the most part ignoring the commentary of the first 5 books of the Bible, other than in a general sort of way. A critique in which the prophets constantly critique that the Israelites were disobedient to God's will. Yet this speech is at the same time heavy pro-Moses, which the Sadducees were very much supportive of. On the other hand, Stephen's speech adds fuel to the fire of the charges against him, that he has said some things that could be interpreted as against the holy place. After all, we must accept that to the Sadducees, to the Jewish people of Palestine at the time. That temple was considered a holy place. They were of the belief that that's where God was. And so he clearly has not done anything to help himself when it comes to that part of the charge. Therefore, he is confirming their accusations. One scholar says that he is speaking against holy places. He is claiming it is not God that's there in that temple. God doesn't have an earthly made temple. So therefore, your claims that he's in that temple cannot be true. His key point is that the entire permanent building concept started by Solomon is in violation of God's will, that the temple was a temporary place to be placed wherever God's people were at any particular point in time. God cannot be contained in an earthly temple, as the Sadducees currently ruling the temple believe, and that they also, by being able to rule Judea as Romans rulers. In other words, under Rome they had the authority to rule that area. Therefore, they mandated that their religion be practiced in that area, their version of Judaism. But as has been pointed out so far several times in Acts here, up to this point, there are many versions of Judaism that exist at this time. It's not just one. There is the temple version, and then there's various other versions. And one of those versions is this early form of Christianity that's there. Why we cannot even be contained by the God's can't even be contained by what's in heaven, much less by anything that's here on earth, is Stephen's point. What I am teaching, Stephen is saying, is what God wants taught. It's God's will. And what you are teaching from the temple is not. Clearly, that, as you read between the lines, that's kind of the idea that's presented here. Several scholars also note this is the key theology of the first 8 chapters of Acts. Luke's position is that the temple is not teaching God's will. It is not obeying God's will. But man's desires, in other words, what's coming out of the temple is what man, the priestly man in this case, wants, rather than the will of God. That the will, by understanding then the will of God, is what Jesus was teaching, which the apostles are trying to continue. Instead, Jesus fulfills all the Old Testament promises, is the concept that's here. His temple is not, or any other temple is not, consistent with God's will. God's will is not the building. It is not the church building. Recall, Luke is writing all of this, however, after, even though he's referring to events before, he is writing all this well after Christianity has survived and transitioned from the temple, from Judaism into its own faith, and after Rome has destroyed the temple and the Sadducees ruling class in Judea, and therefore the surviving Judaism that's available even at the time Luke is writing this, it would then have been the Pharisaic version, which is the rabbinic version, which is happening in the synagogue and not in the temples. So, at the time of the writing, monotheistic faith of Abraham, that Luke, at the time Luke is writing, survives in 2 places. It survives in rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, not the temple run by the Sadducees. And so we'll see next week, or in the next lesson, we'll see that they stoned Stephen, of course, and that's what we'll deal with. But this is sort of the background that scholars leave us with to take a look at and consider as we try to interpret what's happened in these first 7 chapters and why Stephen then is going to suffer the fate of martyrdom. I hope that gives you some things to think about. Have a good Bible study, and we hope to see you in the next lesson.